Very good afternoon to you and welcome. Well, today we focus on the prima donna whose voice sells more recordings than any contemporary opera star. She had colleagues fired from the cast if they were getting too much applause. She once hurled abuse from the stage of La Scala in Milan at the managing director up in his box. She was the woman in Aristotle Onassis' life until Jacqueline Kennedy came along. She was the one and only La Divina Maria Callas, who was born to a Greek immigrant couple, George and Litsa Callas-Ethna in New York in 1923. Ethna Tinney has been fascinated for years by the singer and is going to tell us about this enigmatic personality. We'll also be hearing some of the many recordings that Callas made. She was undoubtedly one of the great opera singers of the 20th century, Ethna. But why now, 20 years after she has died, is there still such an insatiable interest in her career?
Well, I think the short answer to that, Mike, is that she was the last great diva. If what we understand by a diva is somebody who is larger than life off the stage, as distinct from on the stage, she demanded the attention that is generally only accorded to royalty. But I think that the key to the reason why people are still fascinated by Callas is that there simply hasn't been anybody who could rival her for fascination, not as an artist, and we'll come back to that, but as a person, as a woman.
Yeah.
I think that Callas inherited her tremendous dramatic instinct from her mother. And you see, Litsa was a typical stage mother, and she had both the daughters in their early years doing talent competitions, for example, on American radio all the time. And it was great drama if they won, but it was worse drama if they didn't. And there was no doubt she had separated from her husband. Well, she did separate from her husband when she took the two daughters back to Greece, which happened when Callas was about 13. But I think that Maria's feeling about her mother was that the mother was always using her daughters. And in this context, it's quite interesting that what happened to Jackie, who was the beautiful elder daughter, ended up becoming the mistress of what we call a minor Greek shipping tycoon, a guy called Milton Empirikos. And that was, if you like, her career, which was really nothing in comparison to what the ugly duckling Maria achieved.
Well, how did Maria start to sing? Right, the mother had decided these are going to be stars, they're going to be famous, and I'm going to make sure they are. But when was it the mother then who discovered that Maria had the singing voice?
I think in fairness, yes, it probably was. I mean, she had both the daughters trained in piano lessons. This was still when they were in New York. And Maria apparently used to sing spontaneously. And clearly, I mean, she had an incredible voice, so even as a child, it would have been noticeable. So her mother turned her into a little singing doll, if you like. But you see, the problem was that she was a big child for her age, and her voice was far too big for a child of her age, so people probably regarded her as something of a freak. And I think that this was another very telling aspect of the way that her personality developed, you see, because it's not very nice when you're 11 or 12 for people to be regarding you as a freak.
No.
And in a sense, she accepted that. And for many years, and even after she married Meneghini, she allowed that aspect of emotional deprivation to turn her into a bigger and bigger freak. At the same time, when they went back to Greece, she was most tremendously dedicated to becoming a good singer. I mean, they were in Athens during the Second World War when Germany had overrun Greece, and it must have been dangerous for her to go to the conservatory in Athens on a daily basis. There were snipers, there was a resistance movement, and yet for years she did this and sang even for the German occupying forces. You know, for Callas, even at that stage, the only thing that mattered was to sing, and sing she did.
Right, we're going to more about Meneghini and her career shortly, but we are going to intersperse our chat with some of her recordings. So what are you introducing first of all?
Well, I think that an interesting recording to listen to, first of all, is a live performance that she did in 1953 in La Scala. It was one of her very early performances there, because as I'll tell you later, she was kept out for a while. But you see, what's interesting about her singing Lady Macbeth is that really this is not a role for the sort of soprano that she had trained herself to be. She wanted to be a high soprano, and Lady Macbeth is written for a dramatic soprano, or indeed a mezzo. It was designed for a mezzo. But I think what you can hear in this particular recording, which is live, it was taken live from a performance in 1953, is, can you imagine the excitement being in the audience and looking at this big young woman coming out and singing this
Weighing her.
kind of music.
Weighing what?
At this stage, she was nearly 18 stone.
Oh, and singing like this. Well now, no wonder the audience are applauding there. That was from a 1953 live performance of La Luce Langue from Verdi's Macbeth by Maria Callas. Right, Ethna Tinney, back then I started to ask you about the man she married, Meneghini, an unprepossessing man to all intents and purposes, but he was a significant influence on Maria Callas's career, wasn't he?
Yes, I think it's an example of two people's needs coming together. You see, basically, very briefly, what had happened was, after the Second World War, Callas decided, and she was still called Calligaropolis at this stage, that she would go back to New York, where her father was still living as a chemist, and try her luck over there. She knew her qualities, but it was a question of trying to find an international operatic stage to show them on. And she failed dismally to get the Met, for example, in New York, or any of the opera companies in America to take her seriously. But during one of those auditions, she was heard by Nicola Rossi Lemony, who is a very, very fine baritone. And he had been engaged to sing in the arena in Verona, where they have this summer festival, which still goes on, and which requires big voices. And they were going to do La Gioconda, and it's very hard to find a Gioconda because it requires a very big voice with a big range, which is what Callas had. And so he recommended her, and she got the date. She was offered 4 or 5 performances of Gioconda in Verona. So off she went with no money at all, on her own, headed off to Italy, where she had never been in her life. She gave the performances. Tullio Serafin was the conductor, and he wasn't that impressed with her. There were no offers coming afterwards. But she had met and been heard by Meneghini, who was like an opera groupie. And there she was, this ungainly, overweight young woman, she was only 23 or 24, stranded in Italy without even the money to get back home. And he more or less took her over and made money available to keep her there in Italy, to enable her to do auditions in all the major houses. He financed her. And this went on for quite some time. He also proved to be a very astute and tough manager. And eventually, after 2 years of this, she married him. But already by the time she married him, she was beginning to make her mark. She was getting the dates and she was making an impression. But my feeling about it was that if she had waited another 2 or 3 years, she would never have married Meneghini. Because to me, it was a complete compromise for this young woman with her huge talent and possibility of a great future to tie her star, if you like, to a man. It wasn't just his age. Clearly he was more than 20 years older than her. But you see, I mean, for example, he would come to her performances and he would fall asleep. There was no way that he could actually relate to what she was doing from an artistic point of view. And so I feel that it was a marriage of convenience that certainly helped to accelerate the establishment of her career.
Well, she was still overweight now when she met and married Meneghini.
Oh, absolutely.
She was, right.
It was about 48, 49.
And then she began to make inroads at La Scala and ultimately to appear in La Scala.
That was interesting too, you see, because once Meneghini realised that she was making waves, he immediately, now she was engaged, for example, in the poor old La Fenice in Venice, which recently burnt down, and various other I wouldn't call it a second strand house, it's a first strand house, but La Scala is obviously the big house. And it was run by a man called Ghiringhelli, who was a little bit like Meneghini actually, an industrialist, not a musician, but a real dictator. And for quite a number of years, for about 3 years or 4 years, Ghiringhelli ignored Callas. He would offer her opportunities to replace singers that had become ill, and she always turned him down. Now, she was singing in all the other great houses around Italy, but he would not put her on the roster. He would not announce her for the programme. And therefore she said no, and she was right. And eventually he had to cave in and offer her the opening night in the season, I think, of 1952. And that was when it started. So that Macbeth is actually a fairly fresh account of what she gave for herself. She would still have been competing at that stage when she did Macbeth in 1953 to show what she was made of.
And wasn't it Ghiringhelli she insulted, hurled abuse at from the stage of La Scala one night to thunderous applause?
That's right. This was partially due to the fact that, you see, Meneghini was such a tough manager of her that he would increase her fee in a way like doubling every year. So if you got her for $1,000 last year, you're going to get her for $2,000 this year and for $4,000 next year. And of course, Ghiringhelli felt sort of held over a barrel, and he resented this enormously. So there was fighting going on all through the 50s between himself and Callas, and she also felt that he denied her good artists to work with, good directors, good conductors, that he tried to cheapskate on the side since he was paying so much for her. And on this famous occasion when she was singing Donizetti, Anna Bolena, and it's the abuse that actually she's giving to Henry VIII in the opera when she's been taken to the scaffold, and she said, "La vedi il palco funesto," look at him up in his horrible stand. And the word palco means box as well as scaffold in Italian.
Okay.
So, and she pointed straight at him. He never used her again.
Yeah.
Well, virtually.
Why was she motivated to lose all the weight, and did her voice disimprove after she lost it?
I think she was motivated to lose the weight around about 1953, which we've heard a recording from, when she was now beginning to establish herself as a sort of prima donna assoluta in Italy. So now, for the first time, perhaps, she was getting an emotional return for her own private, whatever went on in her head. She was getting it from the audiences. She clearly wasn't getting it from Meneghini, to whom she'd been married for 4 years, and the weight kept packing on. But once she found herself in a situation where she was admired, unequivocally, by audiences, obviously at a certain stage, she was able to distance herself from herself sufficiently to say, this is ridiculous. I'm 18 stone. She was always beautiful, but she was a colossus. She was literally a colossus bestriding the stage. And there are some people who saw her, by the way, in those days, that said there was nothing more magnificent than seeing an 18-stone Callas coming onto the stage to sing Norma or Tosca or Brunilda, and that even though she became totally beautiful afterwards, that it wasn't the same excitement. And I think I can understand that. But I feel that what she wanted, you see, it was like an awakening of the Sleeping Beauty around about 1953-54, when suddenly she realised that she could be a woman as well. She didn't just have to be a great opera singer, because she was a very, very passionate woman. And I think that she wasn't getting from her marriage, I think that's quite clear, any endorsement of that. So her next aim was to become a beautiful woman and to fascinate the world in that guise.
More music. The next piece, please. This is actually from Norma. This is one of the pieces from Norma we're about to hear, isn't it?
Yes, Casta Diva, which was one of her kind of quintessential roles. She identified with Norma, and that goes back to what I was saying about the Passion, because the whole thing about Norma is this Druid priestess who stepped outside of her vows and has 2 children by the Roman proconsul. And then when he tires of her and wants to run away with her handmaiden at Algisa, she sacrifices herself on the pyre as a sort of expiation of her sin, and it's quintessentially passionate. And Callas always said that she identified with Norma more than any other character.
Well, now there we had Maria Callas with Costa Diva from Norma, with the chorus and orchestra of La Scala Milan, conducted by Tullio Serafin. Ethna Tinney, let's talk about her contemporaries now. You mentioned at the beginning of this interview about the early days in Athens when Maria Callas even sang to the occupying German forces. And some time ago we were discussing Elizabeth Schwarzkopf on this programme, and of course there are all kinds of hidden things about her relationship to the Nazis and so on, some of them not so hidden, that she did get involved and so on. But so Schwarzkopf would have been a competitor of Maria Callas's, as indeed would Renata Tebaldi have been. So what was the relationship between all of these?
Well, in my view, you see, first of all, let's say that Schwarzkopf was older than Callas. Schwarzkopf was born in 1915, Callas in 1923. So therefore she was older, which I think is something that would have relaxed Callas. Secondly, there was a business relationship because of Schwarzkopf being married to Walter Legg, who was the EMI producer who signed up Callas to EMI. So in Callas's view, she would have been careful about her relationship with Schwarzkopf. Also, Schwarzkopf had a small voice, and the repertoire that she excelled in was not the Callas repertoire at all. Whereas with Tebaldi, she was head on with an Italian artist, much her own age, slightly younger actually, who was beloved of the Italian public. So it was a direct confrontation. Now, as far as Callas was concerned, and she was extremely competitive, and that is quite clear from all the interviews with her. She was a fighter, and she said that herself. And you also have to remember that the Italian audiences can be extremely partisan. They are not above booing an artist because they are actually holding a candle for an alternative artist. And Callas is on record as saying that it was like entering a gladiatorial arena, and that you had to face down these people by singing so well that your fans would more or less prevent the cabal for the Tebaldi fans from ruining your performance, you see, which must have been extremely difficult.
Didn't she also often try to upstage Tebaldi by turning up and sitting at a box level with the stage? And didn't she drop things during major arias?
Drop her bracelet and be having the ushers coming down, flashing lights in the middle. Yes, she behaved absolutely atrociously. Absolutely atrociously. And I think the truth of the matter is that Tebaldi was a very nice, sort of kind person. Nobody who makes it big time in opera is totally nice, because you have to have a cutting edge. But I think here there's no doubt that Callas was the aggressor in the so-called Tebaldi-Callas war. I think that my own view is that Meneghini was a very, very bad influence on her during those 12 years that she was married to him in this particular regard. I think he had no feeling whatsoever for Callas's tremendous artistic superiority. I think he only saw her as a business, and he used to stir her up against her colleagues. I mean, this is quite clear and it's quite documented. And so you have the incidents, for example, with Tito Gobbi, where Meneghini felt that Gobbi was taking too much applause at the end of the second act of Traviata, and he went scurrying around backstage to work Callas up against Tito Gobbi, and there was this dreadful standoff between them, and Gobbi really had to tell her where to get off. And she accepted that. But you had the situation with Delmonico, for example, who was a really superb tenor, who she requested not to sing a high B flat in a certain aria on this particular night because she felt she wasn't in good voice. And then she went on and she took the B flat herself. And he was left stranded. He was left stranded, so he never sang with her again. You know, she would do these things in the adrenaline rush of performance that were really not very attractive.
Right. What about the other people then that she worked with? I mean, she worked with some of the great names. You're talking about Visconti, you're talking about Zeffirelli. And then, of course, with the great conductors as well.
She did indeed. And in fact, one of my favourite recordings of her is Trovatore, where she had Von Karajan conducting. And just in terms of a great recording with the orchestra and the forces really well marshalled, that is a great relationship that she had. But getting back to Visconti and Zeffirelli, I feel that, you see, Callas had this weakness to be manipulated by people, by her mother in the early stages of her life, by her husband right through the 50s. And Visconti, who was a very, very selfish man, a very artistic man, took her up and wanted to make film on the stage with Callas. And the result was she started to sing all this, what I would call rather dull repertoire. Lesser known Bellini operas, lesser known Donizetti and Rossini, surely because he felt that they would make a great visual opportunity for him, because remember, he was a designer as well as a director. And by contrast, and I think she wasted a lot of her best years singing in opera that didn't deserve her great talents, let's put it like that. Whereas with Zeffirelli, who was younger, there was no doubt in my mind that he absolutely adored her. He would have done anything for her. And in her declining years, when she had more or less withdrawn from the stage, it was Zeffirelli who tried time and time again to get her out and offer her productions that would entice her back onto the operatic stage. And he did his absolute best. But by then she had lost confidence, and he just couldn't get her to that point. She would agree and then she would not.
The piece we're about to hear now, Visidarte, is this from that declining years period of her life? Is the voice not in such good condition?
Yes and no. This is a recording I've only come across recently from 1965, and she made her last operatic appearance in that year in Covent Garden as Tosca. And you get an awful lot of biographers of Callas who maintained that the voice was declining in the previous 10 years, and by 1964 and 65 that it was only a shred of its former self. Well, I think our listeners can judge for themselves. But for me, this recording of Visidarte is incomparable. And I think that it's partially because, to me, Callas is Tosca. It was, to me, this was the role that she was, the opera singer, the jealous, passionate person, the risk taker that Tosca is. And she sings, I lived for art, I lived for love. And that's exactly what Callas did. And this was taken in 1965. And let nobody tell me that this voice wasn't worth hearing for another 10 years.
Well, she was only 41 when she recorded that. As you say, Ethna Tinney, there was certainly, by the sound of that, at least another good 10 years in her. That was a terrific performance, obviously, RTE. A little shaky maybe on the very high bit, but super performance.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, definitely because of the pressure that she had put her voice under. I mean, my own view is that she was probably naturally a mezzo. When you listen to her speaking voice, it was quite low. And obviously during her teens, she'd pushed the voice up. So therefore, she was going to have to pay for that in later life. But, you know, so many great singers have overcome that kind of disability on the top, you know. It's not that important for the audience, for the listener. What matters is the passion and the commitment and the wonderful artistry. And none of us mind a bit of a wobble on the top, for goodness sake.
So good. Aristotle Onassis, when did he come into her life?
Well, interestingly enough, you see, people say terrible things about Onassis with a view to Callas, but I think that in some senses he made her as a woman and destroyed her. He came into her life in 1958. And she sang a gala performance, and it was actually her debut in the Paris Opera. She had never performed within the operatic, if you like, cycle in Paris. And they invited her, she was at the absolute peak of her fame now, to do a gala, which was just her, with kind of odds and ends singing around her. And she performed in front of the President of France and the Chief Minister, and all the glitterati were there in 1958, and was televised. And in fact, I have a copy of the video, and it's very, very interesting. And Onassis was there. And there's no doubt in my mind that he said, I'm going to get me that woman, because she was so famous. She would be like Princess Di now. She would be welcome anywhere. Everybody knew who she was.
And like Jacqueline Kennedy was subsequently.
And became even more so, you see, after the death of her husband. You see, this was something. But yes, Onassis just decided he was going to get Callas. Of course, he was a Greek, so that would appeal to a certain kind of fundamental thing in her, who was also sort of basically Greek. And so she left her husband and she became his mistress. And this went on for many, many years. I mean, people don't realise that. They think he more or less took her up and then he left her. Not so. He only kind of sidelined her nearly 10 years later, when Jacqueline Kennedy decided she was going to kind of make a play for him, or accept him. And I think that's because Bobby Kennedy had been shot. I mean, Jacqueline was still in there with the Kennedy clan as long as there was a possibility of another president. And you see, remember at the time, Onassis was thinking he might be the president of Greece. So there was that attraction for Jacqueline Kennedy.
But so he only dropped Callas then, wasn't it a couple of days or something before the wedding to Jacqueline that he dropped her?
Yes, well, I'm sure she was aware of what was going on, because all the papers were talking about it, but he didn't have the courtesy to tell her what his plans were. And she took it very hard. There's no question about that.
So what happened to her life after Onassis dropped her? Didn't she go off on a tour with Giuseppe Di Stefano?
Yes, subsequently, that was 72. Onassis married Jacqueline Kennedy in 1968, and at this stage, Callas was living in Paris. And Di Stefano, who had been an early partner of hers during the 50s, his daughter had cancer. And therefore he persuaded Callas to come back and do this huge world tour with him, to make money basically, which she didn't need because her royalties were very good. And she did it. And in some ways it was kind of a little bit sad, because obviously they were only accompanied by piano on the stage, and this was not Callas's métier. And when you look at tapes and recordings made of some of those performances, you wish that she hadn't done
Not
it.
a success.
Not necessarily, but maybe she was happy. And he maintained that she was. She was happy to be back out in front of the public.
She had a lonely death.
She had. And that was 5 years later. That came 5 years later in Paris. And she had become very reclusive. Now, maybe she had an affair with Di Stefano. It seems that maybe she did during that tour. But that's common thing to happen with singers who are working and travelling together. And perhaps he was the last hurrah before she kind of sank back into this very reclusive existence in the Avenue Mondel in Paris, where she had a nice flat, and she was looked after by a couple. And the extraordinary thing, a man and his wife, who were a chauffeur and a housekeeper respectively, and an extraordinary thing was that when she died, and it looks like she was taking drugs, but uppers and downers, sort of light drugs, and that her heart gave up, but there was no post-mortem ever done. And you know, that was dreadful too. And by the time Meneghini got up to Paris, her body had already been cremated.
He survived her.
He survived her, yes. And still held a candle for her, absolutely. He still adored her. Whether he loved her, he still adored her after all that, even though he'd been separated from her for 10 years.
you have lined up a particularly poignant aria with which to finish.
Yes, this is another of her great roles from Traviata, Addio del Passato. Everybody says that nobody sang Traviata like Callas. And this is a wonderful recording taken from 1952 when she was vocally absolutely at her peak. I think not only vocally but artistically, this is quite unbeatable. And the only thing that makes me very sad when I listen to it is that it was almost like a premonition of her own lonely death to happen 25 years later in Paris.
Maria Callas at the peak of her considerable vocal abilities. That was the aria Addio del Passato from Verdi's La Traviata, recorded in either 52 or 53. It's not clear which from this CD. Well, next Monday evening at the National Concert Hall, Ethna Tinney will be telling the story of the Dangerous Diva with the help of sopranos Catherine Smith and Marie Hegarty, the tenor John Scott and the orchestra Classical Graffiti. The programme will feature many of the arias associated with Callas during her all too brief performing career, such as Casta Diva. Ethna Tinney, thank you very much for coming in, joining us and telling us about the life of this spectacular singer.
It's a pleasure, Mike.
Well, the Callas industry, of course, goes on with new reissuings of recordings made at all stages of her career coming out all of the time. That brings us to the end of our programme for this afternoon. Back tomorrow at the usual time, 2:40.